Hey everybody, Jake Thurm on behalf of V1 Sports. The 2025 Genesis Invitational champion is Ludvig Åberg, and it was played at Torrey Pines this year, not Riviera, due to the fires. And let's break down the very fundamental golf swing of Åberg. When they talk about textbook golf swings, probably in the dictionary, you're going to see this one. Ludvig, being a taller golfer, actually stands very close to the golf ball. You can see his arms are pretty much hanging down from his shoulders. We run a plumb line up through him. You'll see that it goes kind of armpits, elbows, knees, and ball of the foot. Let's take him in his takeaway. We're going to stop at a few key positions, and for all the amateur golfers watching out there, probably there's some inhuman stuff that he does, but there's also some very good stuff that you could do to help your game. So takeaway right here, you're going to see that his club face about halfway back, so that would be somewhere in there, is slightly closed of the back line. Now, matching the back line, so the red line and the red line, slightly closed to the back line. Very much the opposite that we see with most amateur golfers. Most amateur golfers have a lot of early pronation or rolling action of the forearms that gets the club inside the hands. His club is outside the hands and gets the club face wide open. So they are already behind the 8-ball, just taking the club back. We're going to leave him there on the down line. We're going to look at the face on. Again, we'll put a couple lines as a reference point. Notice how his arms are soft and on his sides. Now they will get a little bit more in front of him, a little bit pressed together, kind of like a Hogan here. Hogan talked about having his arms kind of wrapped up and tied together in a rope. But interestingly enough, when he would waggle and get set up, they'd be soft and on his side. It was kind of almost his trigger to move them a little bit closer together. So you can see that. See how they're getting a little closer together and in front of him. And then he's going to go. What you're going to see is you're going to see a micro move shift into the trail side right off the bat where he loads his right hip. A modern power play move in the takeaway. Yes, power in the takeaway. Is to load immediately, pressure back into the trail side. So you can see that center of the pelvis is shifting back. His hip goes into that red line, into the red line, and a fairly stable upper axis point, which means a steady head. Okay, so he is loading his right side, and his spine gives the appearance of being vertical at the top. So again, for anybody out there who wants to hit the ball farther, you actually have more work than you think right off the bat in terms of loading that right side kind of from 1 until 2. Get all the way to the top, recentering move. You can see how his head is actually translating forward just a little bit, just a couple inches. And then here's a key position right here, and we'll go back to the downline view after. Key position right here, lead arm parallel on the downswing. His center of rib cage and his center of pelvis is right on top of each other. This is a key move to getting pressure in the lead side sooner rather than later. The center of pressure is moving forward early. The center of mass is moving forward towards a target. Yes, even the upper center is translating a little bit forward. You can see how that lead side of his hat is a little past that red line off of its initial starting point. So the upper center is moving forward too. It's the key thing to do in irons. Let's go back up to the down the line view. Again, keeping the club face relatively looking at that golf ball somewhat matching that red line as it goes back. You see at the top, classic position here, a flat left wrist, club face looking square to maybe even slightly closed. Kind of that's how he took it back. His hands nice and deep at the top, okay? So we got a pretty full rib cage rotation. Again, back to the target, if you will. A pretty good amount of hip turn as he changes flex in his knees, and that is what allows his left arm to match his shoulder plane somewhat. So you can see that left arm maybe slightly higher than the shoulder plane, but the hands plenty deep, and what I would call a nice balance of the elbows at the top of the swing. Let's take him down to that lead arm parallel. So you can see that his depth of his hips is actually further. It's deeper than its initial starting point. Makes sense, right? Because in the backswing, he is rotating his right pocket behind him, and that's what creates the depth. That pelvis rotation creates the depth that allows him to maintain his dynamic posture, okay? So we'll go right to this lead arm parallel. Again, another key position. You can see that the hips are deep. The fists are in front of the chest, and the butt end of the club is roughly, if there was a laser beam, it's probably not pointing at the golf ball. I know it looks that way in 2D, but roughly pointing somewhere on that target line. All right? Now we see after lead arm parallel, you're going to see his secondary axis tilt, his upper body tilt back, because now the pelvis is starting to get out from under the rib cage. So the center of pelvis has now worked forward of the rib cage. His head is almost in that initial. Remember, that red line on the lead side of his head was his head's starting position off the lead side. So his head has now moved back to that position. So he has a little bit of an away tilt because his pelvis is now out from underneath his rib cage. Very kind of quiet, albeit with the feet. I would remind you, though, that the ground's going to be pretty torn up, though he is not lifting off or jumping off the ground like we see a lot of the other power players. So we'll call this lower body action quieter. How he moves his foot a little bit quieter, a little bit more connected to the ground. But trust me, there's nothing quiet about it. He is tearing up the ground, especially around that lead foot. That is what makes him powerful. You can see in this delivery right here, pretty much now we're matching that lower back line. Club head somewhat in line with the path of the hands, kind of at last parallel of the club. And again, that hip turn is still on that red. So he has still maintained his depth while rotating his lead side out of the way for delivery. Hands always exiting left. Never measured a guy in 3D that wouldn't have his hands exit somewhat up, somewhat left through impact, which goes very much against what amateur golfers believe. They think they're supposed to stay down. A lot of them tell me they're supposed to literally swing the club and their hands out away from them, and yet you will always see all of these guys, these elite level players, are pushing up from the ground, opening so the hands go up, and in this case, left through impact, okay? So that is your handle rise through impact. You can see he's a little bit lower from the starting position of his head, but that makes sense as well because of the depth maintained by his hips. Rotates through to a nice balanced finish. Love this. We call that a straight line finish, kind of where his right shoulder is out ahead of his left leg. His left leg is actually behind him. So many of these players, because they get pressure in the lead side early, then they get to react with their leg and their hip moving behind them, or something I call running backwards. Their lead side is actually pushing up, open, and going behind them, and that's why when they finish, his right shoulder is actually very slightly, definitely ahead of his left hip, but almost ahead of his hips. This is a great swing to look at for covering iron shots and making solid contact. One, because the upper axis, the head, is fairly stable. Two, to have an upper axis that is fairly stable, he is shifting his base not only back, but through and out from underneath. Great swing by Ludvig Åberg. You are going to see him win a lot of tournaments, probably majors, probably this year. I really think this is a future world number one.